you for coming to the second of our Brown Bag series this fall. We're going to be doing another one in 2 weeks at noon, same location, same place on Wednesday. So keep your eyes out for a poster. Bill Halton will be talking about the election in light of the new truthy media that we have. So thinking about how the media functions in this election potentially differently. We're excited to have Seth Weinberger share with us his insights on foreign policy in this election, responding to the question of, is Trump a national security threat?
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. It's always great to see you guys taking time out of your day to learn more. That's always good, so thank you all. So what I want to do is I'm going to start by making the case that first, foreign policy is the most important thing that you should consider when you're deciding who to vote for. That foreign policy is the most important thing that the president does, and that it should be the thing that is at the front of your mind when you're thinking about voting for the president. And then from there, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see the election in terms of foreign policy, and particularly focusing on I thought about not doing my talk and just reading his answers from the debate, but that would be unfair to him. So first, like I said, and while I think many of my colleagues might disagree with me, I would argue that foreign policy is the most important thing that you should take into account when you're deciding on who to vote for. People generally care more about domestic politics, and I think that's obvious why. It more directly impacts your life. It has more direct effect on you, the people that you know, the communities you live in. But I would think that foreign policy is actually the most important thing the president does for a couple of reasons. First, the president has more power over foreign policy than he does directly over domestic policy. Right? Those of you who've studied American politics are probably familiar with this, right? That the system that the Constitution sets up generally constrains the president much more significantly in domestic policy than it does in foreign policy, for a variety of reasons, which I can go into in the Q&A if you want. The president has just a lot more independent authority, things that the president can do without approval from Congress, things that Congress, even where Congress has the sort of the actual constitutional or legal authority to check the president, Congress has all these incentives that explain why it rarely does. Congress rarely challenges the president in foreign policy. Congress rarely challenges the president on these sorts of things. The president can deploy force. I would argue without congressional authority, not everybody would agree with that, but the history is clear. He does do it. The president often deploys military force without Congress. The president can recognize unrecognized countries. The president can negotiate and sign treaties. While he does need congressional approval of some sort to get those treaties implemented, the president can also withdraw from those treaties without Congress. So there's just a lot more that the president can do independently. And of course, I probably don't have to talk about how important, not that domestic politics isn't important, but regardless of who's president, there aren't many decisions the president could make that would literally kill millions of people. Right? While, of course, war is the outcome of, well, not always bad decisions. Sometimes war comes out of good decisions. But war is, of course, the most significant consequence of foreign policy. War transforms the international system. It kills thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And so if you get somebody in the Oval Office who does foreign policy badly, the consequences are dire. So I believe, and I do, and I would argue, that foreign policy is the thing that you should think about the most when you're thinking about the president. Again, not everyone's going to agree with that. So what does thinking about foreign policy tell us when we're looking at this election? Right? It's a really complicated time. More so than it has been in the last maybe 2 or 3 elections. We have ISIS and we have Al-Qaeda causing instability in the Middle East, attacking Western countries, either directly or through proxies. We have the Syrian civil war creating massive destabilization, creating massive humanitarian crises, massive, of course, the refugee crisis. Syria is very likely to get worse in the near future if, as it appears they are about to do, there is about to be a massive assault on Aleppo, which will create a humanitarian disaster of unprecedented proportions. The refugees aren't just, of course, the refugees in the Civil War aren't just creating problems in the Middle East. Right? The refugee flows, of course, are putting pressure on the European countries, the European Union as a whole, stressing the unity of the European Union. They are not the only, but certainly one of the causes of the decision of Great Britain to leave the European Union. It's contributing to the global rise of nativist domestic forces in the United States as well as in Europe, and it's also putting pressure on the rise of what is increasingly being called the illiberal democratic forces, and the example of this would be Erdogan in Turkey, right? Leaders who are sort of pandering to domestic fears and yet not actually respecting democratic or particularly liberal democratic norms. And it's not the only cause, but the refugee problem, the Syrian civil war, is certainly contributing to some of the problems in Turkey. Of course, we have the rise of China and Russia, right, countries that are becoming increasingly powerful, increasingly challenging, and that's, of course, too simplistic a view. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but increasingly challenging American leadership and the system that the United States has set up. We have North Korean nuclear proliferation. We have growing opposition to free trade and globalization, right? So we've got all these issues that are coming up into a head in ways that we haven't seen. Not that foreign policy is ever a bed of roses, but it's a little bit more complicated and more challenging right now than it has been in a few years. Right? Clinton's policies, foreign policy, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end, are more or less, I guess, what we would call mainstream. And by mainstream, I'm not talking about whether or not they're sort of Democratic or Republican, right? Although there's not a whole lot of difference in the ways that Democratic and Republican administrations approach foreign policy. There's a lot more variation in domestic policy, more or less, if you're talking sort of as a general rule of thumb. Foreign policy is relatively consistent across Democratic. So what I mean when I say that her policy is mainstream, I don't mean that it's mainstream for Democratic administration. It's pretty much within the realm of how we think about foreign policy, how the United States has approached its foreign policy over the last 50, 70 years. Right? She wants a slightly stronger approach in Syria. She's a little bit more hawkish on that than Obama. She's talked about creating a no-fly zone. She has stated her opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the free trade agreement with Asia, although nobody believes that she actually means that opposition. It's almost certainly just political. And I'll talk a little bit more about her policies, right? But her policies fit within essentially the long tradition of American foreign policy, going back really to the end of World War II, when the United States decides to assert itself on the international stage and really to become, at the time, one of the, and now perhaps the only really dominant sort of superpower. Trump, of course, has trumpeted his opposition to mainstream policy. His policies are certainly not within the mainstream, and that's what I'm going to focus on. At a speech in Cincinnati back in, I believe it was in June, Hillary Clinton made the point that risk analysts, and this is a quote, risk analysts have listed Donald Trump, a Donald Trump presidency, as one of the top threats facing the global economy, even more dangerous than terrorism. Now, this statement was rated true by PolitiFact, the fact-checking organization. Now, not the assessment of whether or not he is, but the fact that somebody said it, right? It is true. The Economist, one of the leading political economic journals, comes out of, I think it's still out of England, ranked a Donald Trump presidency as the third biggest threat to destabilize the global economy. A Trump presidency was behind a collapse of China's economy and the complete destabilization of global currency markets, and it was ahead of jihadi terrorism, which was ranked 5th. So that was a true statement in the sense that The Economist, a serious magazine, thinks that the Donald Trump presidency is a very significant threat to destabilize the global economy. I, in this talk, am actually going to go farther than that and argue that a Donald Trump presidency would be the single greatest foreign policy threat that the United States faces today. Right? And not just the United States, that he in fact represents the single greatest threat to the foreign policy, to the stability, to the peace of the international system. Right? I have been studying, working in, and teaching foreign policy and international politics for more than 20 years now, and I am not speaking hyperbolically. which I do a lot, but I am not mad, that a Donald Trump presidency is literally the most dangerous thing I've ever seen. Literally, and I mean that seriously. I think it is a threat to the system of alliances that underpins global security. I think he would greatly increase the likelihood of war. I think he would undermine the global free trade system. You don't even need to get into his pathological lying, his insecurity, his bullying, or even the things people think he might do. If you take him at his word, if you take the things he says that he would do, or the things that he believes, I think that is enough to make this case. And I want to be clear, this is more than whether or not he has good ideas or bad ideas. Right? Not everything he says is a lie, right? And not everything he says is patently absurd. There are things he says that in and of themselves are either factually accurate or are reasonable, right? So he says that American allies don't pay their fair share. Right? That is a technically correct claim, right? I'll go into that a little bit in a minute, right? He argues that the United States should be reducing its presence. It should be pulling back, moving away from its alliances, trying to force American allies to shoulder more of the burden of their own defense. Right? There's a very serious debate in the foreign policy community and the international relations community about that, whether or not the United States should, and maybe even more importantly, whether or not the United States can continue to maintain its policy of primacy that it's had for the last 50, 70 years. Okay? But that's not really the question, right? So the question, you can't look at whether or not an independent claim that somebody makes is reasonable or not. The question is whether or not the policy, as it fits together, is reasonable. What does it mean for a foreign policy to be reasonable? I think it means three things. Right? A reasonable foreign policy is based on a realistic understanding of the world. And here, for those of you who've had international relations, I don't mean realism, the way of thinking about international relations. I mean, is your understanding of things based in facts, right? Do you actually understand what is happening? And do you understand the way in which things work, right? So I mean, do you actually have a realistic understanding of the way that the international system works together, the way that trade works, the way that alliances work, okay? That's the first, right? The second, do you have a coherent understanding of American power and the way in which that power connects and interacts with the rest of the world, right? Is there a relationship between the way you think about power, the way you think about the exercise of power, how you think about how that power should be used in the international system, and the likely outcomes that will produce, okay? And then finally, do you understand trade-offs, right? Does your foreign policy understand trade-offs, right? Things are connected, doing something in one area causes effects in others, right? So I would argue that a reasonable foreign policy has to do those three things. It has to be based on a realistic understanding of the world, it has to be based on a coherent understanding of American power, and it has to take into account trade-offs. And I think Trump's policy fails on all three of these. Right, so currently, the world is in the midst, and I use the word midst intentionally because we can't say it's in the middle because we don't know when it's going to end, right? The world is in the midst of the longest period in modern history in which the major powers of the world have not fought each other, right? We're over 70 years now, and that is astonishing. If you know anything about world history, right, you know that basically and by modern history, I mean, I'd probably start sometime in the 16th, 17th century, but you could even go back farther than that, right? European history in particular, world history more broadly, was basically defined by wars between the major powers for hundreds and hundreds of years. Right? And 70 years is, without a doubt, the longest period we've had. So why? Why do we have this long period of peace, a period of overall economic growth, a long period of stability? I'm not going to go into depth too much in the causes. If you want, you can take PG 103 with Professor Clayton Meckes in the back, Professor Kendall, or eventually whenever I teach it again with me. I think there are three things that explain this. Okay? The unprecedented, the unchallengeable power of the United States. Okay? Right? So one of the things that leads to peace is the fact that the United States is simply so powerful that rivals don't think they can get anywhere by challenging the United States. Two, globalization and the expansion of free trade, which has created economic interdependence, which has linked countries together, made it economically costly to go to war, and has increased the benefits of peace. And I'm grossly simplifying here, right? So if you want details, I can go into those in the Q&A. And essentially the spread of what I will, for simplicity's sake, call essentially liberal values, right? The growth and the spread of democratic values, the number of countries that are now democratic in some way or shape of that term. Okay. So those are the three factors that I think explain the global system. I think Trump, in his foreign policy, literally threatened all three of those. And that's what I mean by a threat, right? These are the things that I believe have kept the system stable. And I think to some degree, almost anyone who takes international relations seriously would, maybe in different ratios or proportions, point to one of those three things and say that's what it is. Some people might think it's all about power. Some people might think it's all about free trade, right? But there aren't many people who think it's something other than one of those three things. All right. So I'm going to ignore the debate because the debate was almost literally incoherent, right? So the best thing that Trump has said about foreign policy was a speech he gave in April. Okay? So in this speech, he identified 5 weaknesses in American foreign policy. This was, I believe, I don't have it in my notes. I think this was the speech he gave to some Veterans Association or something. Right? He described 5 major weaknesses in American foreign policy. Okay, so let's take a look at what he thinks is wrong with American foreign policy. That gives us an idea of what he thinks he would do differently. American resources are overextended. 2, American allies aren't paying their fair share. Those two are pretty much the same thing, but he talked about them separately, so I will too. America's friends think they can't depend on the United States. 4, America's rivals do not respect the United States. And 5, the United States does not have a clear understanding of its foreign policy goals. Okay, let's go into a little bit of detail what he thinks about that. Number 1, American resources are overextended. Here, he's primarily talking about the trade deficit. If you watch the debate, he talks a lot about the trade deficit. Right? He talks about how the trade deficit represents a theft of American jobs. He uses that language. He uses that language very particular. Right? He talks about how the role that the United States plays in the international system, and particularly its role in this global economic trading system, essentially is a binary law. It's a gain for the foreign community. Right? Other countries are gaining, and the United States is losing. Right? He, in fact, he hasn't used it recently. This is maybe one of the things that his advisors have gotten him to do. He actually used to talk about how the rest of the world is raping the United States. He would actually use that word. We're being raped by China. We're being raped by Mexico. Right? He stopped using that, but I think it just gives you a sense of how he's thinking about this. Right? He thinks about this in a very kind of binary outcome. Right? There are jobs, right? And if the jobs go there, then we must be losing. Okay. So American resources are overextended, right? And again, so I mean that doesn't really sound like an overextension, and I think that's sort of part of the confusion. That's why 2 and 3 are all kind of the same, but that's what he was talking about. American allies are not paying their fair share, right? As he talked about in the debate, he likes to talk about how very few countries in the NATO alliance pay the mandated requirement. NATO requires that countries spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Only 4 countries do that, including the United States. Okay. The United States, of course, has bases and defense treaties with Japan and South Korea. It has military bases all over the world. It maintains troops, right? And those things cost money. And so this is also connected to the overextended part, right? The United States not only losing in trade, but it's doing all these things to defend the international system, and we're paying for that, and those countries aren't, right? So he talked in the debate about how Japan and South Korea should start paying more for these bases. Okay. Number 3, our friends think they can't depend on the United States. So here he was specifically talking about the Iran deal, right? A betrayal of Israel. In his argument, right? The failure to support Mubarak during the Arab Spring, right? You might remember when the Arab Spring started in Egypt, there was a political uprising, and the United States did not sort of rally to the support of Mubarak. He was overthrown, replaced by Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood, who was then in turn overthrown, and now we're back to a Mubarak sort of look-alike with Sisi, right? But he thinks that the United States should have supported Mubarak from the beginning, right? And that was a very bad message to American allies that the United States won't help them if they're challenged. Okay? As well as what he thinks of criticism of Israel, right? Not supporting Israel all the time. Number 4, American rivals don't respect the United States. Here he's talking about Obama, for example, was not met by state leaders during visits to Cuba or Saudi Arabia, and he thinks that represents a sign of disrespect. You might remember there was a big kerfuffle about the carpet that was laid out and the stairs that were put out for Obama when he arrived in China for the G20. Right? For Trump, that represents a signal that countries don't respect the United States anymore, because if you respect them, you lay out the red carpet. He's talking about North Korean proliferation and aggression, right? That countries are challenging the United States and not being pushed back. He's talking about Chinese economic assaults on cyber theft of American secrets and business things like that. And fifth, the United States does not have a clear understanding of its foreign policy. So here he's talking about abandoning Libya. I don't think he's denied that he was in support of the intervention in Libya. He thinks that the United States didn't do enough and abandoned Libya. He thinks that the United States, for example, should have seized Iraqi oil fields and Libyan oil fields. The failure to, what he sees as the failure to defend Christians and other minorities in Syria from genocidal actions from ISIS. Obama's refusal to talk about radical Islam, and I mean those words literally, right? This is a big deal, whether or not he says the words radical Islam, right? For Trump, these are all things that represent the United States doesn't really understand what the threat is. Okay? Good. All right. So, what are his solutions? He hasn't given us much specifically. He's talked about a long-term plan to halt and spread the reach of radical Islam. Of course, his immigration plan is somehow tied into this, right? If we keep all the Muslims out, if we keep all the immigrants out, then they can't kill us here. He's talked about rebuilding the military, growing the economy, growing the military. Of course, he talked without details. And he's talked about a foreign policy based on what he understands as American interests. So he's talked about renegotiating trade deals, pulling out of bad trade deals, forcing alliances to pay greater costs of their own defense, trying perhaps to allow Japan or South Korea to proliferate, to better stand up to Chinese aggression, so on and so forth. Okay. So what I'll do in the next few minutes is talk about how I think his policies don't A, represent a coherent foreign policy in the way that I laid out, and B, how they challenge those pillars of the long peace. Okay. So U.S. power, right, which is laid out as the first pillar of essentially the peace. Right? First, I think it's pretty clear that Trump doesn't understand power at all. Right? His constant insistence that he was opposed to the Iraq War, I think, is more than just his lying. I think it represents an inability of him to understand a coherent use of power. Right? So, for example, his reason that he talks about why it's so important to him to be against the decision to invade Iraq in 2002 is because he wants to claim that he was prescient and he somehow understood that American presence in Iraq would destabilize the country, right? And so when he talks about it, he's always talking about what he always says, how, right? That I was talking about that this would happen, right? There'd be an uprising and they wouldn't like it and we'd eventually have to leave. All right. So you take that and then you mesh that with his argument about seizing the Iraqi oil. Right? Well, what would it take to seize Iraqi oil? It would take a very long occupation, right? An endless occupation, which would be an even more antagonistic occupation than the one that the United States had, because not only would it have pissed off the Sunnis, like the American occupation did, it would have also pissed off the Shia, who control most of the oil, right? So the fact that he's so insistent that he was against this, right, while maintaining this argument about seizing the oil, is literally incoherent. It makes no sense. Okay? He talks about how NATO, right, should focus more on terrorism. Well, first, NATO has focused on terrorism. NATO invoked Article 5 and went into Afghanistan with the United States. NATO is a military, conventional military organization that was designed to fight the Soviet Union. Right? It is not great at dealing with terrorism because conventional forces aren't great at fighting terrorists unless you occupy countries. Right? What NATO can do is what it has done. It has gone into Afghanistan and has contributed to the mission there. Right? So NATO could, in theory, go into Syria. Right? But again, there you have an incoherence. Right? He's talked about his plan to defeat ISIS. Right? The United States is already sortieing almost an airstrike a day against ISIS. The United States has already launched 50,000 sorties. I think we've dropped 30,000 munitions on ISIS. Right? That could be more, right? But that's unlikely to change. And so if he's really going to defeat ISIS, it's almost certainly going to take American troops. Right? So again, right, an incoherence in the way that he's thinking about power, right? An American or a NATO intervention in Syria is not likely to be significantly different in the way that it carries out than an intervention in Afghanistan was. Right? In Asia, right, he's talked about trying to allow South Korea and Japan to proliferate, right? Because this will then reduce the burden of defending those countries on the United States, because they will have their own nuclear arsenals, which he thinks will be stabilizing. He's talked about withdrawing troops from South Korea and Japan if they don't increase their pay. He's talked about making trade with China difficult if China doesn't do more to rein in North Korea. There is almost no question, even for people who believe that nuclear weapons are stabilizing things and argue that more countries should have them. Even if you believe that, and there are political scientists who believe that more countries should have nuclear weapons because they make countries behave more rationally, they make countries more stable, right? Even if you believe that, how you get to the point where countries have nuclear weapons is really, really problematic, right? China is not likely to sit back and watch its two major rivals develop nuclear weapons, right? Nor is North Korea. Right? Furthermore, the argument, of course, undermines his argument on trade, right? In fact, one of the things that makes China likely to cooperate with the United States on North Korea is not only China's own strategic interests, but also economic interdependence with the United States. Right? So threatening China on trade, in fact, actually is likely to go back to the days of 10 or 15 years ago when China actually used North Korea as a tool against the United States. Right? He's talked about the Iran deal the Iran nuclear deal as being terrible. Even though there is almost no chance that you could do anything other right now, you couldn't re-establish sanctions. And I think, as was pretty clear in the debate on Monday, he established that he has no understanding of some of the most basic issues of national security. His answers repeatedly on nuclear policy, the nuclear triad or no first use, are literally gibberish. They are literally gibberish. His discussion of cybersecurity revolved around his son and a 400-pound hacker, which is actually, of course, pissed off all the hackers. All right. So, and then just finally, on Sunday, right before the debate, and this didn't come up in the debate, he announced that he would support, that his administration would recognize Jerusalem as the internal and undivided capital of Israel. No president ever, regardless of how much they support Israel, regardless of how Republican they are, has ever even contemplated doing this. Right? It produces no benefit to the United States. The United States already has a very close relationship with Israel. Right? And all it would do is literally inflame the Middle East, the United States' Arab allies, Iran, the so-called Arab Street, the Europeans, right? Anybody who has any hope in an eventual peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians knows that you simply cannot do this. And for someone running for president to simply sort of toss it off as, oh yeah, of course I would do that, is irresponsible beyond comprehension. All right, I'll talk really quickly about trade, and then we'll move on to values and then to questions, right? His understanding about trade is wrong both in terms of facts and in terms of the policy, right? For example, he talks about how free trade deals have gutted the American manufacturing industry. That is simply factually wrong. The American manufacturing industry was declining before NAFTA. The manufacturing industry in the United States is rebounding. We have added 800,000 manufacturing jobs in the last 6 years. Most business analysts think that the primary explanation for the decline in manufacturing jobs is two things. First of all, the simple economic logic of comparative advantage. The United States is a high technology services-based economy. This country is not as efficient at manufacturing goods as other countries, right? And so those jobs go elsewhere. But also, improved efficiency is a huge problem, right? So at the same time that the American manufacturing industry has lost a third of its jobs. So in the late 1980s, we had 18 million jobs. There's now 12.5 million. So 6 million out of 18 million is about a third. Right? At the same time, the industry has shrunk by 30% in terms of jobs. It has grown by 200% in terms of output. Right? It's an area of massive technological improvement right now. Right? We can do more with fewer inputs. Now that may or may not be a good thing. Right? We can talk about whether or not that is good or bad. Right? But it is simply not accurate to talk about NAFTA as being the reason that the manufacturing industry has collapsed. Trade does not, the trade deficit, which he talks about a lot, is not like normal debt. It does not represent a deficit in income or a lack of resources. It does not represent direct costs to the United States' economy. Right? Trade deficit doesn't account for U.S. services that are sold to the rest of the world. Right? It cannot account for those because it doesn't produce things. Services that are sold to the rest of the world don't produce things domestically, not measured in GDP. Right? Therefore, they're not measured in the trade deficit. Right? Trade deficit does not understand, right? It does not represent what, right? In order for there to be a trade deficit, other countries have to hold on to American currency. That in of itself is a value to the United States, right? Those countries holding on to American currency keeps the value of American currency up. Right, supports the United States' economy, stabilizes the American domestic economy as well as the price of imports and exports. And of course, Trump does not talk about the price of keeping jobs in the United States. I'll go over this simply if people want more details. Right, the Federal Reserve estimates that in order to protect or keep a job in the United States, it costs about $250,000 to keep a job. Right? That's just a direct loss of somehow you have to spend it. Right? And just to give you a sense, the American sugar industry supports about 40,000 jobs. That industry would not exist in the United States if it wasn't for massive domestic subsidies. Those subsidies cost $2 billion. Right? So 40,000 jobs kept by $1.9 billion. It's about $4.7 million per job. Right? That's what it takes to keep industries in the United States. Again, that may or may not be a good or bad thing. It might be worth it to do it for various reasons. I'm not making a statement as to whether or not we should or should not do those things, right? But his facts are simply wrong. And in terms of policy, there's no question, right? One of the few things that political scientists and international relations theorists can say confidently, there's not much that we like to say confidently. One of the few things we can say confidently is that economic interdependence has led to a decrease in conflict. Right? That as countries trade with each other, right? It alters the way they think about each other, it alters the incentives that they have, and it changes the way that they relate to each other in a way that makes conflict less likely. Right? Tapping into the voices that he has done, and look, and this is happening globally, right? The Brexit vote was a lot of the same kind of dynamic, right? People afraid about trade, people afraid about immigrants coming in. That's a real dynamic that has to be addressed, right? Trade hurts people in this country. There's no question about that. People lose their jobs, right? The question is, how do you deal with those losses, right? I think, rather than prevent them, right? So a policy that threatens to undermine trade, right, is a policy that threatens to pull the rug out of one of the most important pillars of global peace and stability, let alone something that has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the United States as well as in the international system. For value, right, for the implication of his foreign policy for liberal values, the third pillar, I don't think I have to say very much. Nearly everything he wants to do undermines those values. Building a wall, deporting Muslims, barring immigration of all Muslims, those from terror countries. It's not clear how, right? Most, of course, of the people who've committed acts of terror against the United States who come from other countries have come from France or Belgium or Germany. Restricting legal immigration, increasing mass surveillance. In the wake of the recent bombings in New York, he called for profiling the American Muslim community. He has called for the restriction of information, people who publish information about bomb making or things like this. He's called for that to be restricted. He has called for killing the families of suspected terrorists. He has called for the return of harsh coercive interrogation methods. ISIS has a strategy. They are not secretive about this. Their main strategy is what they call the alienation of the gray zone. The gray zone are Muslims who live in the liberal West, right? Muslims who ISIS believes cannot be integrated into Western society and therefore feel like outsiders. Right? ISIS wants those people to feel like outsiders because it increases the likelihood that then they will radicalize and either tacitly or overtly support ISIS and hopefully commit acts of violence. They are not shy, they talk about this openly. Right? Almost literally every aspect of Trump's foreign policy would play into that, right? Would exacerbate the problems of the gray zone, which lots of people don't, I mean, to be clear, not everybody believes that there is such a thing. In fact, American Muslims show very high levels of integration into American society, right, have produced very few, much fewer than people were anticipating in terms of terrorists or even acts of violence coming out of those communities. But even if you buy the argument that that is a vulnerable population, that strategy is the wrong one. All right. I will finish up so to leave time for questions. I think all you need to look at in order to understand how dangerous this foreign policy is and how this is not simply a question of whether or not you are a Republican or a Democrat, is to look at the endorsements that Trump has not received. Right? Literally every single Republican foreign policy analyst has denounced him and said that he cannot be president. And these are not people who just think he would be a bad president. These are people who think that he would, quote, put at risk our country's national security and well-being, that his expansive view of presidential power would be wielded against his detractors and poses a distinct threat to civil liberty in the United States, that he would use the authority of his office to act in ways that make America less safe and which would diminish America's standing in the world. Right? Those are quotes from 2 letters that were written by literally almost every, with 1 or 2 exceptions, Republican GOP foreign policy analyst. Right? George H.W. Bush is voting for Clinton. Right? Brent Scowcroft is voting for Clinton. George Will has left the Republican Party. Richard Armitage, who was Deputy Secretary of State under George W. Bush and the Deputy Secretary of State under Reagan, is voting for Clinton. Max Boot, Brett Stevens, and Robert Kagan, these are 3 of the leading Republican foreign policy intellectuals, are voting for Clinton. A letter from 75 former ambassadors who do not generally take foreign policy positions openly announced that Trump is unfit and dangerous to this country. This has not been simply a question of bad, right? This is a question of dangerous, of threat, right? Almost literally everybody who does not stand to financially gain from a Trump administration believes that he is not just a bad presidential candidate, but that he is actually literally dangerous to this country and to the international system. And I wholeheartedly believe that. I am uncomfortable making statements like this in public. I do not talk about my politics generally. Former students of mine, I think, would attest to that. And most of the people who are coming out in the ways that they have are people who generally do not like to talk openly about their politics. I do not necessarily prefer Clinton as a presidential candidate. I do not necessarily prefer any of the Republican candidates who dropped out. I do not necessarily endorse her foreign policy, Hillary Clinton's foreign policy. It is, however, a reasonable foreign policy in the way that I outlined at the beginning. It is a coherent foreign policy. It is a foreign policy that takes into account trade-offs, that thinks about American power. Trump does not. A Trump presidency is literally dangerous to this country. So I will stop there. It's about 20 minutes for questions. So I welcome your questions. Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious, over kind of the course of the campaign as it's recently progressed, Hillary has made statements concerning Trump's positions on Russia and de-escalating conflicts with Putin, kind of on a Manchurian candidate. And as you described, NATO being an organization set up primarily to deal with Cold War and Soviet Russia style expansionism. I'm kind of curious if you think that that's kind of a coherent part of his foreign policy a little bit, that it makes sense to decrease kind of NATO activity in that region of the world.
Sure. So what I would say is it doesn't inherently not make sense.
Right.
Okay. Right. There are people who argue that, right, part of Russia's recent